Okay, perfect. Let's start. Everything is ready. So thank you for joining once again. My name is Victor Newstroev. I'm a feeder master, and today our topic is strong squares. When a strong square costs more than a pawn. So what does it mean and what this workshop is about? Let me try to explain it in simple words. Well, I don't know about you, but when I play chess games, I value material. I like material. I like winning material. And then I know that the position is winning and I can easily convert my material advantage. But some positional factors sometimes are better than material. And today's workshop is definitely about it. So the control over a certain square, which is quite important, and allows your pieces to maneuver better, may cost more than a pawn. How can we call such a square? It depends on the position. It can be called an outpost in case if the file is open or semi-open. Open file has no pawns, and semi-open file has one pawn. Uh, so such a square, it can be an outpost if such a square is protected by your pawn and cannot be attacked by the enemy pawn. Or it can be just a strong point, which is not obligatory in the semi-open file or the open file, but occupying which you definitely improve your piece. So please take a look at this position. I'm going to continue with some explanation, but now try to focus on this position and tell me what you think, which square may become a strong square in this exact case. So it's white to move, what white should do to create a strong square, and how they should take advantage of it exactly. Okay, so how does it work? You either comment in the chat or you unmute yourself and say it. Okay, so Carlos suggests to push the pawn to d6 and then suggests to play knight e4. Well, okay, so makes sense what to start with. Now, Carlos, can you please? Oh, okay, David, can you please remove your? Yes, thank you. So knight e4, I think it's queen e7 or queen d8, maybe queen d8. Then they're gonna chase our knight away. Ah, wait a sec. Knight e4, queen d8. The pawn on c5 is not hanging, right? Let's make this move. Knight e4, queen d8. The pawn is poisoned. So, okay, so Georgios suggests to start with this move and then continue with d6. So why the pawn is poisoned? Well, I'm sure that you can see it, but if not, let me explain. When you take such a pawn, your opponent can deliver a check on a5, and that's a double attack. So you're gonna lose a knight. So every time when you decide to capture some material for free, always think what your opponent gonna do. So you cannot make the move and tell your opponent and have in mind something like, okay, come on, surprise me with your reaction. No, every time before you make the move, you should always try to predict the next move of your opponent. Well, it's okay if you make a mistake, but at least you should try it. If you don't, then it's very likely that you miss something. Okay, so d6 in this position, according to what Georgios suggests. How does it work? We're gonna be chased away anyway. So that's why I don't see a point of knight e4. Then the knight still goes back. So if you want to play d6, you'd better play d6 right away. And yes, d6 was played. So why d6? Who understands? Why d6 is such a good move? This is the game actually between two classical grandmasters, Max Euwe and Miguel Najdorf. Belongs to the pawn on d7. Okay, guys. So I'm sure this workshop will be extremely helpful for you because according to your comments, I see that you misunderstand the idea of d6. So first of all, let me tell you what. Okay, so your suggestions are, let me read it. Restricts the bishop on c8, which is partially true. Yes, it restricts the bishop, but that wasn't the main idea behind d6 move. Then says that it blocks the pawn on d7, which probably means the same thing, that the bishop cannot join the place of action, which is correct, but that's not the main idea. Okay, so Berenice thinks that it controls c7 and e7, which again is only partially correct. The key idea of this move is to vacate the d5 square and occupy it with your knight, because the knight on d5 is a really great knight. So Max Euwe, when he played it, he was even okay to sacrifice the pawn on d6. He needed only the d5 square, because he thought that with the knight on d5, his position and his pieces get new opportunities. He doesn't want to lose the pawn right away, but well, he anticipated that at a certain moment of the game, this pawn can be lost because it's hard to find a defense for the pawn, while it can be attacked with these two pieces, the bishop on f8 and queen on f6. Okay, fine. Let's continue. Okay, first of all, some theory. When doing an outpost or creating a strong square for your piece makes sense. Well, let me explain several critical situations. For example, if you attack the enemy king and you need a strong point to transfer your pieces to the king side, then yes, so creating such a square is definitely a good plan. When you get a strategic advantage, for example, you move the piece there and you see that your piece being there either restricts enemy pieces or creates new opportunities to get your pieces coordinated and play for a win in a different way. When else? When you create weaknesses in the enemy camp. Any weaknesses. Well, and when you restrict enemy pieces, of course. Okay, how do I determine whether uh, this square is worth sacrificing a pawn? Okay, that's a good question. First of all, I'm trying to visualize once I get my piece there, what advantage I get. So I do improve the knight. But it's not an easy task to win this pawn. So first of all, in order to win it, they have to play these moves. It's too tempy. And at the same time, the enemy position doesn't get improved, even if they take, because my knight d5 stops any exchanges, like anything. So overall, you have to calculate a few moves more and decide whether your opponent is able um, to stop your initiative, or the initiative is a long-term advantage, and even with that extra pawn, you can still play for a win. Because this time, the most favorable outcome for black could be to get rid of both pawns. So they not only need to take on d6, they need to get rid of the pawn on d7 to let their pieces out. Actually, let me show you something. I'm playing the game on chess.com right away. It's not about the outpost, but yeah, let me show. Chess.com. Um, so it's a daily game that I play. Which one? This one probably. No, this. It's not an outpost, but I want to explain. I see that you don't see the full screen, but let me do it in a different way. So when does it make sense to sacrifice a pawn? Look at the opening. So I'm not sure if I played it well. I don't know much theory here. Knight e7 surprised me. I played queen g4. Probably a3 is the best move. But again, I'm not sure. So I played bishop d3, he played that, queen f4. So he did c5, I played that. And in this position, I decided first to take, and then I sacrificed the pawn. Oh, wait. And then I sacrificed the pawn with b4. Does this pawn sacrifice, does my initiative cost a pawn sacrifice? Yes, it does. Why? Because, well, he did take. Sorry. He did take. Then I played knight b5 in order to play knight d6. He took there. That's another check. So I'm 2 pawns down. Obviously, the pawn on a3 dies. So I will be only 1 pawn down. But look at my pieces. So I defend on c3, and now I can do anything I want. He played that move, attacking my knight. Okay, knight goes to g6. He played that move, attacking my pawn on c3, so I just castle. He can win the third pawn, but look at these pieces, they do not participate in the game. So if he decides to take on c3, knight takes c3, queen takes c3, then I play rook a3, so I'm 2 pawns down only, and then my rook goes to g3. And most of my pieces are coordinated for the kingside attack, while his pieces are absent. They are not doing anything. So this is exact case that we are sacrificing 2 pawns where my initiative is more than 2 pawns, so it's worth more than 2 pawns even. Did I explain when I how I understand whether sacrificing a pawn is worth an attack or occupying a square? Maybe a bit complicated, but at least you can get some feeling or some understanding of that. Fine, let's go back to our scenario. So d6 was played. They didn't win this pawn right away, but let's try to simulate this scenario. For example, rook e8. Not rook d8. Why? Because d8 probably occupies the square for the queen if the queen needs it. And what now? Knight d5? No. Okay, let's just play e3. Let's develop pieces. They play that move. They are ready to take it. Should we sacrifice the pawn now? Well, if we do knight d5, it seems that they can capture on d6. And to be honest, I still see some advantage, but I cannot say that that was the best way. So black still struggles with development of these pieces, while the white pieces are ready for the kingside attack. I can even castle to the queen side and then initiate a pawn march on that side. But if that happened, I think after bishop of8, I wouldn't play like that. I would try to hold the pawn alive. They go that way, to stop knight c7, because knight c7 would trap the rook or would cost him a rook, because it could be a fork. So, and the d6 is protected. Well, you may ask me, why did I vacate the d5 square if my knight went there? Well, I have the second knight, and nothing can stop it coming to d5, because every time he moves his knight to b4 somewhere else, I play knight c7, and he faces with material losses. Okay, wait. It's a wrong button. Let's go back. So queen d6 was played, knight c6, e3, and white continues pieces development. Black, in order to survive, develops their pieces too. Fine. Well, how to play in this position? Well, obviously, knight e2 can be played, and that's not a mistake. But before doing this move, white decided to play bishop d5, and it doesn't hang the pawn. If queen takes, it's what? It's bishop f7. So let me show you. Queen takes, bishop f7 with a discovered attack. So the pawn is poisoned. That's the reason why black continued with king h8. And after king h8, it was knight e4 to keep the pawn alive. Queen goes to d8. And what now? What do you think? So the pawn on d6 stops the enemy pieces from joining the king side. There is only like pawns, bishop, and maybe the rook. Right. And because we see that the enemy pieces are on the other side and can hardly join the place of action, They can hardly join the king side. That's why it makes sense for us to focus on the king side play. For example, knight d7 is not playable. Knight d4, no. Bishop b7, yes, but the bishop doesn't participate. The rook doesn't participate on the king side. And the queen controls only several squares here. So doing a pawn march and exposing the king could make sense. So, for example, such move like g4 could work. And if f5 we take, and then move the knight, and then the knight goes to h5, it works really well. In the game, Max Euwe started with h4. f5 was played, and then he plays knight g5. Makes sense? Yes, because the knight is still poisoned. So blocking, now the king has no squares, so blocking is a must, and then the black's position is totally destroyed because white attacks on the h file. So bishop b7 and g4, opening it. Well, it was already possible to win material like that. Knight b4 with a discovered attack doesn't look like a problem. We can just move the rook or push the pawn. So g4 was played instead to win faster. e4, b2 is hanging, but nobody cares. Knight e2, still it's poisoned. Bishop takes, and this is where I want you to suggest a move. So imagine you're white, black captured the pawn, they threaten our rook, but how should we play? Okay, all right. It allows us to play knight f4. Well, on the one hand, you can just play this, and then knight f7, win in exchange, and that's fine. Maybe, well, you may have some issues with the pawn on f2, but it's still playable. However, white decided to play knight f4, and knight f4 works better because imagine they take here. You can play knight g6. King has to move. The only square is g7. Then you take on f8. And then you're about to take there with a check. So how do they play? Maybe they play this move. So king goes to f1. And now what? Should they... No, well, should they take that way? But then with this, you have a strong attack. The queen goes to h5. And the king is in a serious danger. Okay, fine. So the game continues with queen f6. They wanted to bring the queen, which was a good decision, in order to secure the king's position. G takes f5, opening it. And still, that was the best way. After which, I think white would continue with that, pinning and threatening with a fork. And after bishop a1, after bishop a, then no, this move for which just this, king g7, and something like that would allow white to win. So clearing the g file leads to checkmate. However, this is what was played in the game. How to play that? What do you think? Yeah, knight g6. Knight g6 is a good move. So it's protected with the pawn, so it's fine. They have to move the king, sorry, the king to g7. And in this position, according to what I see, the best way was just to bring the knight to f4 and threaten with this move. Well, white decided to take on e4, and I cannot blame them because it's a good move too. So bishop c3, king moves. The knight is required to attack the queen. And after this move, it was rook g1, and no, this is so f2 is protected. Queen h3 doesn't make much sense. However, the best option was knight f4, and then rook g1, and this is a completely winning position. With knight g6 coming, maybe with queen h5 coming at a certain moment, just knight c3 is a threat. So this is where they resigned. But how to play? Let's say they save their bishop, for example, bishop e5, then rook g1. He goes that way, and with knight g3, you get a winning position, even being down in rook, the whole rook. So, for example, queen here, bishop here, and knight g6, you win one material. I mean, you win some material, then you continue the attack, you can bring your queen. That's a disaster. I don't think it's gonna work. Fine, fine. Okay. What about knight g6 instead of knight g3? Let me check it out. Knight g6. Actually, yes. This knight g5 I think can be played because if pawn takes it's queen h5. So the king moves. f2 is hanging, unfortunately. Maybe we have to play f4 or so. Okay, maybe too risky with knight g5 now. Yeah, so okay, so with knight g6 you trade and you do not and you let the enemy rook to join the place of action. So maybe it's not the best idea. Knight f7 in that case, but in that case knight f7 they take, and you have a rook versus three minor pieces at the very end. Okay, well, how White realized their advantage wasn't the main outcome that we should get from this game. The main idea was us to understand for us that d6 is required, even despite that you make this pawn a weak pawn, you get the control over the d5 square. So it's quite logical that the knight joined there, but White decided to not sacrifice this pawn, and what he did is bringing the bishop to active position from which the bishop could attack, and that was crucial because the king couldn't go to g8. And then knight e4, supporting the pawn and chasing the queen away, which then allowed white to continue with the attack. So, in fact, the d6 pawn move allowed us to get the control over the d5 and bring pieces to the attack. And on the other hand, d6 prevented enemy pieces from development and from improvement. So this bishop didn't participate in the game, and if this bishop is blocked, the rook on a8 doesn't participate anymore. So they have to spend several tempi, which are required for white to start the attack. Let's take a look at another example. The position looks drawish. It was Karpov playing Anatoly Karpov playing against Garry Kasparov. Well, the white's pawn structure looks better. Their pawns are on the dark squares, which is a good strategy when we have to play against a light square bishop. But that's not enough to play for a win. However, this is where Garry Kasparov makes a critical mistake. He captures on h4. You may ask me, what was the mistake? It was just a trade, so he didn't blunder anything. But now I want you to think and tell me which exact strong squares does the knight achieve? I'm not saying bring the knight to that strong square right away. I'm saying what you can potentially occupy with this knight and how does it improve your position. Mhm. So everyone agrees here that the f4 is such a position that the knight should occupy. That's right. And Garry Kasparov didn't take. Well, if he takes, it's difficult to use the f4 square. So for both the king and the knight, that's why he plays knight g2 right away, even sacrificing the pawn. But how? So his knight gets the f4 square and the king gets the h4 square and the pawn on h5 dies, which allows white to do the king's maneuver from the side to the side and shoulder enemy king away and try to win the pawn on f6. What about h3? h3 actually doesn't work because they lose this pawn anyway. So you may say bishop f5, but then knight h5. Every time h2 is played, the pawn is lost. So, and if not, then you do that and take it anyway. Well, with the knight, of course. Once you play king h2, you can take it with your knight. Maybe you don't even require, you're not even required to move the king, but you can push g4, drive the bishop away, and take with your knight. If this, it's always that. So the pawn cannot move. So that's why doing h3 makes no sense. And Gary did his best and captured it. However, that wasn't sufficient. Why? Because the h5 is captured and the knight gets not only this, but that. Bishop g6 could make sense, but after knight f4, bishop f7, king h4, knight h5 is played. The pawn in game is winning. So let's say king is this. They take, it's completely winning because white is able to do this side maneuver, king h6, and now what? So the king goes there, you go that way. You shoulder him. Let me show you. So f5 this. Now either the king moves or the pawn is lost. If the king moves, the pawn is lost anyway. Maybe king e7 is a better move. Actually, no, because then we can even push the pawn and it's still the same story. The pawn on f6 or f5 is lost anyway. Okay, fine. So that's why bishop g6 was a useless move. The game continued with this. However, knight f4 is a check. The king goes there, sacrificing the pawn on d5, but capturing the d5 pawn allows them to keep this pawn alive. That's why Karpov took the pawn on h5 instead, because he understood that clearing that pawn allows the king to invade the enemy territory. However, while the enemy king is tied down to the defense of the pawn on d5. So king e6 back, knight f4, and the king is here, which now allows the white to improve their position. So bishop d1 was played, and this is where Karpov made a mistake. So white made a mistake. What exact mistake they made? They sacrificed the pawn on f3. And made the position drawish. So we shouldn't continue the analysis. I mean, do the analysis in details. I just wanted you to understand which opportunities the knight could get on f4 and that the king could go through the h4, h5 to reach and capture the pawn on f6. So king g6 was a bit of inaccuracy. So the best way was to bring the king back and then maneuver the knight and bring it to c5, attacking a6, which would mean extra pawn because it's almost impossible to defend it. It's a double attack, so bishop moves, you take on a6, you bring back, or you can just move the king, and if they play king b6, it's a fork, you take on f6 anyway. So they cannot save the a6 and f6 simultaneously. Maybe bishop b1 is a better move. Well, maybe, but then the bishop is unable to attack the pawn here. So king h4, bishop c2, king g4 back. It's kind of a Zugzwang. And if bishop d1, then knight goes to d3. If bishop b1, then I think we should play king h5. Or just knight h5. King e6, this. Actually, no. Yeah, so what we should do is to get the g6 square and the knight to c5. Anyway, it's not so important. Let's go back and discuss what happened in the game. King g6. Another mistake was played. He shouldn't capture on d5 right away. This pawn is lost. He'd better play knight h5. And after bishop f3, knight f6. Then he just comes closer and takes it. How? For example, bishop f4, king g5, bishop d3. and knight g4. So this, that, and then the task is either to bring the king to e5 or the knight to c5. I can also illustrate how it's possible in this scenario, for example, why not king e6? Okay, why not king e6 in this position, let's say? King g5 anyway. So let's say bishop g2, and now this move becomes playable with the idea of doing knight to c7. So king d7 is a must, then that way and king e6 no longer possible, which allows us to come closer. For example, this. Okay, let's say the bishop moves, then that, and this. Actually, let's go back a little. This. He goes that way, king f6, knight f5, and then we can finally occupy it and then attack it with the king and the knight one more time and finally win it. Could they play bishop h3? Yes, they could, but it doesn't make much sense because it's still the same story. Our task here is to play knight f5. If we trade, it's winning because black is able to attack the pawn from behind. If they don't take, then king e5 and king e5, and the pawn is hanging then. We can also attack it with a knight, so the pawn will be lost. It's a bit complicated, but well, you'll see. Something similar happened in the game. Knight d5, king e6, check, and this is where Gary could play this move, but played that, and now the game is lost. It's quite a complicated example, so I wanted just to simplify it for you. So knight c5, the king doesn't go to b3. Also a strong square for the knight because it definitely improves the white's position. Bishop c6. How to play for a win? What do you think, by the way? So the main problem is that once we move the king, we hang there. And if we move the knight, we let them playing king b3 and winning the pawn on a3. So any suggestions? Okay, so the pawn on a3 should be sacrificed. Knight d3, and if the king goes that way, you can play knight f4, because when they take, you can push that move. How does it work? Let me explain. So first of all, well, if they take, you support the pawn on b4, and because of that, it's winning. If they move the bishop, where? Let's say they move there, then you can play that move, and you also support the pawn. So how do they play? This fails, because just d6 and capturing there means that you can promote, or you can take and then promote. And if this move, it's knight c5, or if the bishop is not there, for example, king d4 first, and then knight c5, d6, and so on, or even king c5, protecting both pawns and advancing the d pawn further. If the bishop goes that way, then you can play at the very least d6, and after this move, you have two options. On the one hand, you can play knight d5 and protect the pawn because the knight is poisoned, or you can play knight d3 and then just do that stuff. The next move is king c5, which allows you to protect both pawns. The rest you need is to find how well, actually, the rest you need is knight e5 and d7, and you're gonna win the bishop. So it's an easy win. What happened in the game? Bishop g2, knight e5, king goes there, knight g6 to go there and push d5. King c4, so knight f4 works, but Karpov decided to play this move. Bishop b7, d5 may not win the game now, because if you push d5, they can take. And if you take this pawn in game, even with extra pawn, is not winning. Because they are able to keep initiative. So king f4 allows this and then that. So that's why the white king should just keep shouldering. So that's why knight f5, threatening with a fork. Bishop moves to not fall under a fork. Knight d6 and the pawn on b5 is lost. The king moves, knight b5. So with 3 extra pawns, it's definitely winning position. Here, even knight d6. Why? Because after king e3, how can you win?
Just push the B pawn.
Yeah, just push the b pawn forward. b5, he comes closer, b6, b7, and he has to sacrifice the bishop to not let white to promote. Fine. So what this example was about. So even in the endgame, especially when you see that there is no way progress, it does make sense to sacrifice a pawn, but to get the control over the squares, which make your pieces better. So by exchanging these two pawns for one on g5, white was able to reach the f4 square with their knight, the h4 square with their king, win the pawn back, and do the side maneuver and attack the pawn on f6 with winning chances. So here the f4, because of liquidating the pawn on g5, the f4 was a very important strong square that white should occupy. Let's continue with our next example. So these are the next two examples are really very very illustrative game fragments. Let's take a look at this position first. It's a modern game, so it was Maxime Lagarde, a French grandmaster, playing with black pieces. I didn't play against him, but um, I played the game on the neighboring board. So I was playing against GM Mitchell Krasinkov on the third table, and he was playing against someone on the fourth table. Okay, anyway, so look on the second table, don't remember. So look at this position and tell me what black should be doing. It's Benoni, and actually it's a sharp line of Benoni, but I didn't think that white played properly. What I don't like is that the knight is only 2. Okay, John sees how we can win exchange. Pietro suggests to play h6, bishop, wait, Pietro, h6, bishop h4, g5, and then what? You get the e5 square at the cost of a pawn. Seems too risky. Okay, so you mean knight g4 in this position? Well, yes, that makes sense, actually. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a good strategy. Well, g6 exists. Oh, yeah, g6 is a problem. Once you take, they take there. So how do you have to move? If you move there or there, they take with a check. If you move that move, they play e5. Okay, and then you are still in trouble because they take your rook. No, 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 no. So knight g4 doesn't work. So probably that's the reason why h6 and g5 strategy doesn't work. You can play h6, but then the bishop goes there, they cover f2, and knight g4, queen b6 lines no longer work. Okay, so let me see. Let's use John's idea. Oh, okay. No, there is another idea. So Bernice suggests to play c4 to sacrifice such a pawn and then to occupy the c5 square, which makes sense. It's a very common strategy because then the pawn becomes poisoned. Sorry, but because then the pawn on e4 becomes weak. However, you can combine this idea with queen b6. So king h1 is the only logical move. Rook f2 makes a pin. And then you can win the pawn on e4 just because your knight is no longer pinned. At the same time, you can play knight g4. It's not a mistake. Yeah, c4, this is what was played. Instead of c4, you can play queen b6. Let me explain how it works. For example, c4, they take, and then you play knight g4. Well, the best move is knight e4, but if you play knight g4, you win exchange for sure, because you threaten with these two threats. Queen d2, knight f2 takes, and after f5, they have a compensation. They are about to play bishop to e3, and then your queen can hardly escape. Queen e1. What do you mean queen e1? There is e1 covered with the rook on a1. Queen e1 in this position. Then this is a fork. So you face with material losses anyway. Okay. Let's go back. So c4 was played. Actually, queen b6 and c4 are approximately equal moves. Well, bishop c2 to keep this pawn protected. Queen b6, king h1, and this is where knight g4 was played. So that allowed us to keep the c4 pawn alive. And why do people play it in Benoni? Not only because they want to fight for this square or improve the knight, but because they vacate the c5 square for the knight and this knight on d7, which in the original position didn't have much space, gets a very good square. So knight g4. How to play in this position? Well, queen d2, letting black to win exchange, and then f5 would make a lot of sense. But still black is better. Black is not better if in this position the bishop captures on c4. So if, for example, the same line occurred, but the bishop from d3 didn't go to c2 but captured the pawn on c4, then white would be better. Then in this position, black is better because there is one extra pawn. But white played bishop h4, pinning that knight. Knight f2, rook takes f2, queen takes f2, bishop b5. How to continue? Queen b4 with a6 coming. At which position queen b4? Queen c5 probably with a6 coming. Makes sense. But c4 is hanging. So what should we do? Pietro suggests h6. h6 makes sense because the bishop does not have a square. So h6 was played. How do they play? What do you think white should do to not lose a piece? In order to not lose a piece, at least they should create a similar threat. Oh, e5 as a threat, I think fails. So how does it work? This, take. Bishop c4 exists. Okay, then it's what? Where does the knight go? To c5 maybe, to b6. Yeah, that's okay. But let me see. So maybe for e5, I can just take first and then take on g5. e6 now takes. g7 is hanging. Okay, fine. So yeah, e5 works actually. Oh, I have a another suggestion. A6. They take. Oh, okay, so still fails. They played queen e4, and queen e4 seems to work better. How? So we take there, and they take there. And we cannot do anything else. We cannot play these moves to defend on d7 because of the bishop. We first need to liquidate the bishop. After g takes f4, they resigned. I mean, white already resigned, but let's decide why. Why cannot they play something like that? What do you think? What's the best way for black to take advantage of this position? So just one accurate move and the white's position is totally ruined. Yeah, it's bishop c3. So bishop c3, if knight takes, you can play queen b2, double attacking. If they take with a pawn, you take on a4. So with extra exchange and with the idea of doing a 3, with the idea to capture the knight, you should be completely winning. Okay, so how does it work this time? Well, the key idea was to play c4, allowing the knight to go to the c5 square in future, as well as opening the diagonal. So here, by sacrificing the pawn, you can activate the queen and take the control over these two important squares. Wasn't there knight b6? Yes, we're gonna answer. We're gonna check it a little later. So if bishop c2, then queen b6 still works, and these two squares are crucial for our position and are a real problem for our opponent. Okay, let's go over this scenario. Isn't there a knight b6 move? So queen a3. Yeah, queen a3. Then what? Black is still winning, but it seems to me that capturing the bishop on g5 was a better decision. What do you think we should do in this position and what white gonna play with? Oh, okay. So the rook is hanging. Can we make a rook move? So according to Zamfir, we should play bishop g4. Let me see. Bishop g4. Two knights are hanging then. I think it's a good move. Take bishop e2. Not fully sure that it's completely winning because I see some counter chances, but it should be winning actually. So knight b6, queen e3. We can play this move, but after a trade, there is a knight hanging, and the bishop gets another square to escape. So that's why that wasn't so helpful because of queen e3 attacking d6. And if the rook moves, we can get our rook even trapped. So that's why the simplest way was just to take on g5. Bishop takes, and take on a4. So it's extra exchange and how many? One extra pawn. And the pawn on e4 is also lost. Okay, so again, by opening the position, by playing queen b6, we could get the control over these two squares, occupying which created serious tactical problems for our opponent. Now, the last example, which is my favorite one. However, before we proceed with this last example, let me remind you that these workshops are absolutely free. However, if you would like to, if you enjoy this content and you would like to support me, there is a way to send a donation. Let me share the link with you. So you can do it either through PayPal or through Wise. Let me explain how it works. You click on this button. It redirects you to, well, a pop-up window appears, and here you can enter the amount that you want to donate. It can be any amount. You click this yellow PayPal button, it redirects you to your PayPal account. So you enter it and then you can send money automatically to my PayPal account. The second way is to use Wise. So my username at Wise is Victor N394. So just use this link if you have Wise. Okay, fine. Let's continue. Okay, please take a look at this position and tell me what you think. I think it was Italian game. So d5 was played and the knight had to go to d8, which I don't think is a good square for the knight in this position. The black pieces are already restricted. However, what would you play? And can you please specify why? So white to move, what would we play? First of all, let me tell you, the move that white played in this position was really great. I would play too, but the engine actually disagreed with us. I analyzed this game with the engine too, and the engine says that, well, the move that was played in the game was good, but was not required, and white could just develop pieces and then play for a win. But let's decide. I think the first move is on a short phase, but you need to calculate whether it's a promising move or not. Mhm. Okay, Pietro suggests to play d6 and then bring the knight to h4 to bring it to f5. Makes sense. Any other suggestions? Occupying this square with the bishop. Okay, Smart suggests to play d6 and to bury this bishop for a long time. D6. So everyone agrees to play D6. Right. So this is what I would play too. It's a very common move, even if it costs you a pawn, because such a move slows down the enemy piece's development. Well, the engine suggests that you should castle, but then it allows them to play D6, which is still not a super good position for black because their pieces are really bad. But why not D6? So I don't fully understand why from, well, according to what I understand about chess, d6 is a really strong move because it restricts enemy pieces. Well, if they take with a pawn, we don't have to rush. We can castle, knight a6, let's say. Yeah, everyone would play d6. Every human player would play d6. And then what do you think? Oh, a5 is a good move, but it's not stronger than d6. A5 doesn't have a plan behind. It's just a move to restrict the bishop. So, but d6 is a move that starts a long-term plan. Yeah, you can play a5 as the first move, but d6
I
is
mean,
required.
e5 as first move instead of d6.
Yes, and d6 is the second move, right? Okay, so a5 and then d6. So what would you play here? Actually, a5 was played later in the game. Just rook e1 according to Brian. Brian, what's the purpose of rook e1? Just
Gonna. I understand they're not threatening to take on e4 right away, but I still would like to line up the rook with the queen and king.
well, that would work well in case if you had in mind how you can open the e file, even just hypothetically. But it doesn't, it's unlikely to happen in this exact scenario. Okay, so there are really good examples, suggestions, I mean, by JD and by Zamfir. You should take on f6. That's actually right. You should take on f6. Well, first of all, why? Well, they were threatening to take on g5. That's not a big threat, but look at how the pawn structure is changed. So if g takes, you can go that way, threatening here and here. So how do they have to play this? Well, maybe, which allows you a lot of things. At the very least, queen g4, attacking here. No, well, I'm not analyzing castling because you win immediately. So let's say king f8 maybe should be played. And after that, you have a lot of opportunities. I would recommend starting with a5, bishop a7, and then just knight bt2. Because how do they develop pieces? If knight e6, it's always knight f5. So let's say maybe this, but again, they are not threatening much. And let's say this move, knight f5 is coming anyway in case if they do so. And we're gonna open the f file and checkmate the king on f7, or at least win material. Right, so spending that bishop for the knight to ruin the structure, because if they capture with the queen, you can already take on d6, or or you can just play knight e3. No rush. This pawn is not important. The most important thing is to control these two squares. So let's say bishop here, knight there, and then you can bring the knight this or that way. Well, b4 way, because if you go to e3, then they capture on e3. Castle, we can take with the queen, or you can play knight b4, bishop b8, you move the queen back, and then bring the knight. So black calculated it and decided to take with the queen because he thought that without queens, there is less risk for the black's position. So queen d6, c takes d6. And guess the move? It was like it was in the previous situation, it was the same line, bishop f6, but without queens on the board. Yeah, that's right, pawn takes. Okay, so this is where white decided to let enemy pieces get stuck on the queen side. So what would you suggest? Yeah, bishop d5. Bishop d5 stops the b pawn movement. Bishop c7, knight bd2, the knight goes that way. b5 cannot be played, so that's why they play a rook move. Knight h4, knight f5, we can still have it in mind, but there is no urgency of playing this strategy right away, but we're gonna do it later. Right now, right now you should stop the b pawn, and doing b4 makes a lot of sense. Yeah, b4 takes space. Exactly, Mark is correct. How does it work? For example, if let's say b5 takes takes. Okay, maybe then knight h4, knight f5, and the rook can go to a7. Okay, well, what happened in the game? A5 happened to restrict, because now b5 doesn't save the situation at all. Takes, takes, knight c4 attacking d6. So the bishop goes back. Everything is protected on the queen side for white, so they just improve the knight and win this pawn for free. And then maybe take on f7, depends on where the knight is. So for example, a5, knight goes there, and black cannot develop their pieces. Even if they do that, it won't work. So this, knight takes, 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 king e7, knight f5 back, and then b5. And this pawn falls. Okay. So rook g8. Well, rook g8 only does us a favor because we can play knight h4, protect here, and threaten to go to f5 at a certain moment. Knight goes to c6. This is hanging. But knight c4 and everything is protected. And doing b5, for example, no longer works. So b5 takes, bishop takes, and knight d6, and then knight f7 or bishop f7. If the king goes that way, it's even this, or maybe first let's take and then play that move. So knight d7, attacking this bishop. What would you play in this position? What do you think? Knight e3 was suggested by Pietro. What else? Any other suggestions? So, how to restrict all black pieces?
I want long castle like John.
Why? To add pressure on d6?
That's right.
To take on d5 with a rook, probably. Yeah, makes sense, but they can play b5 or so. So that, well, actually, it still fails. Takes, this. Ah, but without bishop f7 isn't hanging. No, funny, king e6 loses the game. Rook d6 checkmate. Yeah, well, actually every move wins. But I like your idea of knight b6. So Dan and JD suggested knight b6, and actually, from a practical point of view, knight b6 works better. So how does it work? If they take here and then they take there, look at the position. What you can say? How many pieces black is down there? Look at this two. I just don't see the way to improvement. What white need to do, just focus on the king side and then realize their advantage. So these are, yeah, these pieces are out of the place of action and they will never join it. Well, f5, okay. Take on f5. So all pieces are buried then. No, rook g4, no. So how does rook g4 works? In which case? Instead of f5, you probably mean rook g4, g3 just. So it doesn't work well. There is nothing helpful with this move. Rook g5 here, or after knight f5. Yeah, well, it makes sense to play rook g5, and then what? You want to play f5? I don't think it works. Well, let me first make the king move, then you do that. Then I can, at the very least, continue with that move. So take. If not, I'm gonna move there. If take, this. Okay, so maybe let's do better. Let's do better. Let's bring. Oh, f4 actually works. Takes, rook g4, and I don't know, knight f5. They take here. Knight g3. Yeah, that's enough. We should trade this rook, and then with this extra rook, we just capture any pawns and take it. Oh, I would even suggest doing this. Okay, fine. F5, wait, F5, knight F5, rook here. Okay, how should I play? Let me play back. So then rook G4, still G3 works. Trying to make white take on D6. Well, I don't have to. I can do it, but I don't want to because the pawn restricts the black's pieces. Okay, let's see what happened. Knight b6. So rook g5. They tried some counterplay, but castle f5 now. Nobody cares. f3. f4 to bring the second. Pawn to f5, but king f2. It's the end game, so let's bring the king closer to the place of action. Rook h5, g3. And then they have no moves. No, they can try knight g6. But I don't think it works. Take, there is no intermediate this because then this rook is under attack. So they have to take, and in this position, king g2, rook h1, what works better? The idea is to open the line and exchange this rook and invade the enemy camp on the king side. Anyway, knight c6, b4, and knight goes back to e7. It's hard to suggest a good move. Rook h1, f5 was played. Knight g2 threatens the pawn. They take here. Pawn takes. And so nothing seriously changed in the position. It gets more open, which favors white, but black doesn't have any single chance to get pieces improved. Trading only makes the position more closed. So on the queen side, I mean. So that's why they play knight g6. h4, making this already a threat. So h5, then g5. Takes. King takes. Bishop d8, trying to attack, but it's too late. White brings the other piece, while these two are not doing much. So rook goes there, and h5. So all pieces are absolutely stuck. So with h5, we restricted the knight. The knight can still go there. Actually, did happen, but after rook hf1, no, it didn't happen. After rook hf1, they should resign. It's better to play this move. Oops, no, rook f7, I mean. It's better to play rook f7. And if now this move, then we can do that. So what we are ready to do here, we should bring the knight to the game. So I think that something like that, take, and knight f5 is coming. I don't know how to withstand it. So this is how the game ended. But it was already losing. So with these two pieces, we cemented the position on the queen side and switched our place of action to the king side, which allowed us to invade the enemy territory and attack their weaknesses and finally convert our positional advantage to a material advantage. So once again, let's do a quick summary of what happened. So white is ahead in development, they have the central control, and they decide to give up the pawn in order to control the d5 square and prevent enemy pieces development. So they gave up the pawn and got the control over the d5 square. Now they occupied, as well as they can occupy the h5, which restricts enemy pieces. a5 and knight c4, knight b6 was finally played to prevent the bishop developing on that way. And the rest is just pure technique. White needs to open the position on the king side, trade pieces, invade the enemy territory, capture pawns, and promote them. That's why the game was over. With pieces being paralyzed, it's impossible to play. It's like playing without these pieces. So when you see that you have a real advantage, when you sacrifice a pawn and at the same time get the control over a certain square, occupying which you improve your pieces or make the enemy position cramped, then it does make sense to sacrifice such a pawn. I can show you one more example in the Alekhine variation. I don't know if you I don't know if you are familiar with it, but let me show you. So e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, d4. So d6, knight f3. And it's knight c6. So who knows how to play here? So can you please mute you? Okay, I'll gonna do it. Okay, so how to play? Okay, Richard knows. c4, right. And if knight b6? It's e6. If bishop takes, you do a fork. But if pawn takes, they cannot develop their pieces. Neither this bishop nor that bishop. So for example, knight c3, and in order to develop this bishop, they have to play g6. And your reaction to g6, because their pawn is gone, the king side is weak, and your reaction is h4, h5. So bishop g7, I would first play bishop e3 to secure d4. Why? So because if they play e5, I want to push, and then play h5 and still weaken it. And with the bishop, I control this square enough number of times. If they decide to play knight d4, this time I just simply win a pawn back and get a better central control and weaken their king side. If they do something else, my next move is h5. This opening is an example of not how to get the control of a certain square, occupy it, and improve your pieces. It's about how to force your opponent to lag in development. So by a pawn sacrifice, you see that your opponent experienced tough times and several tempi are required to get his position better, but you can develop your pieces quickly and start already creating threats. So this is how it works. Okay, I think that today's topic was helpful for you. You can try to apply this idea with a pawn sacrifice in order to vacate a square and occupy it, for example, like it was here with d6, like it was in this game with c5, which allowed you not only to get the c5, but activate the queen and try to get the control over f2 and d3. Or like it was in the first position, well, it was almost the same move. You didn't sacrifice this pawn, but occupying d5 allowed your pieces to join the place of action, which then moved to the king side and allowed white to initiate the attack successfully. Okay, so thank you for joining. The next workshop will be next Sunday, same time. Do you have any questions for today?
Victor, when are you going to announce the next group classes?
Yeah, I was about to do it probably next Sunday. Most likely, I'll tell you when exactly it will be. So I think in 1 month approximately. And I think we should start at 4 p.m. Eastern time to make it more suitable for me and for Europeans. So usually we start at 5 p.m. But if we do it 1 hour early, I don't think there will be much changes, and it will be more suitable for Europeans. Okay, fine. So thank you for joining, and I hope to see everyone next Sunday, same time.